Thanks all who are still here for this incredible day. We're going to, in this session, present some of the work that was done in the collaboration in the workshop here. And maybe, John, you want to say something about it?
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
Sure. It's interesting that we're showing this after a kind of intense discussion on the post-cinematic, because in some ways, you know, there are overlaps between what we were trying to do and some of that conversation that you just heard. Essentially, the proposition was fairly straightforward. Whole group of us, grad students, Renée, Lina, myself, Javier, wanted to see what would happen if you just pulled together a range of stuff with no unifying motive, no prior organizing motive per se, and tried to create a piece out of it under a broad title of a memory album. So what you're going to see is footage that many of the grad students and FAM provided for this exercise in montage to see whether we can make something. And I mean, I think when you see it, hopefully you can see its connections with some of the conversations we've been having about the post-cinema. Because in many ways, this for me is a kind of post-cinematic gesture. You know, it's about trying to operate with time-based and moving image work outside of the usual, you know, story, money, blah, blah, all the usual kind of so-called permanent fixtures of the cinematic. So, yeah, I hope you enjoy it, and please don't beat us up too much. We didn't have that much time. Thank you.
And then we'll come back. Yeah, it kind of grew out of, well, it took place over 2 semesters. I mean, the whole project took place over 4. And so there were different people coming and going, and some people repeating, and then some students who came from Harvard also who were participating as well. And so during the different visits that when John and Lina were here, well, different kinds of things took place. In the beginning, there were more sort of seminars and presentations, each time different, and each semester the contents shifted and the people shifted. And so in the fall, there were, John and Lina said that what they most liked to do at that time was just to go into production. And I agreed that it would be nice to just to make something. And so then that's how it started. And then the people who were, there were, I don't know, about 7 to 10 people who were involved in that. And so that was produced, actually for the rough version of it was produced in the fall, and then it was resumed really this week. So
I mean, we're only ever here for a week. So a week last semester, the beginning of the week, we sort of started to talk amongst ourselves about what to do, and slowly we settled on memory, right? Yeah, as an organizing motif. And then the idea was, look, it doesn't matter what it is. If you've got something that you're not using, you don't think it's worth anything, not sure what to do with it, put it into the pot, right? So some of it was part of ongoing work, some discarded, some people were thinking through. So the stills from Stalker and Alphaville came from Addy. The swimming in the river was part of, I think, you know, Annie's holiday.
well, actually,
Why didn't you
GPS
say what
investigation.
Okay. Right. Ryan, what was yours then? Can you tell us what yours were?
the Google Street View cut up thing of Berlin, and the weird head thing, and the video game thing.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Ian?
Oh, the cats.
You had more than that, come on, man.
Did I? Yeah. Oh, all the really grungy, high-looking stuff. The ships, yeah, and the woman, yeah. That's about it.
Who else is there? Suyang, what was your bit?
The scenes of a jungle, people on the elephant watching rhino, and exchange of peanut caramels that also happened.
The photography
in
scene with the
Nepal.
sweets
And,
exchange.
And your feet.
Yeah, my feet coming down to the landing ground.
Yeah.
I mean, they're supposed to answer
The
your
hang
question, AJ. We started with a series of lectures, and one of the questions that were asked of us was, when we were talking about Black Audio Film Collective and the collective practice, was how do you make a film in a collective setting? And I think that thought niggled at us in terms how could we translate that practice? How do we get these students to actually understand how we started working? And that was essentially what we came up with. Why don't we try and do something that could illustrate that process? And through the process, we were hoping, and I know this has happened, that people would have developed themselves the notion of how you can collectively work together and what's potential when you come together with various different abilities, sources, and so forth. And I think that's really it was trying to answer a question that was constantly being posed at us in our initial lectures when we were here about how did Black Audio work? What were the organising structures within the group? And I think by putting them to work in this collective process.
No, but I mean the thing was it is genuinely a collective project because, for instance, the title sequence. I mean, I didn't make. That was delegated to Adi and Suyang, and they made it. You know, we tweaked it, but essentially it went in as it was. The music came from Javier. Most of it, he just gave me a folder with tracks on it. 3 days last semester and 2 days this one. I worked quite a bit. I mean, everyone took turns because they're all doing things anyway. They're all in classes and TAing and stuff. So people would take turns to come in and edit bits when they had time, and then they'll go off. But the backbone of the edit this time was Mary. Where are you, Mary? Are you here? Guys, can you just get out so people can see? So that's who you saw me with yesterday. And that was pretty much it. There was no real agenda other than committing to the timeline.
It got really intense in each semester, I would say. Just, I mean, how it evolved. Because when we started, we had that conversation, and the idea of memory came up. I'd also shown John this book, and I've been using it actually since then. Well, recently, this evocative object by Sherry Turkle. I mentioned it yesterday, and thinking about how different kinds of associations, how you think with something, how you think with an object, what happens when you do that. For myself, I just keep thinking about that in relationship to even thinking about a project as an object almost. How do you think with a project? But so yeah, I mean, it was interesting to see how the various intensities coalesced during a very compressed period of time, and then I mean we did other. I think that I mean once there was the idea to do it, then people were coming up with other ideas as well, and were putting in material into that. And so, for example, in the sound and the audio, the voices that you heard were also like from different instances of people. Jaisal Kapadia, who's working with us, people were, Joan Jonas, also her voice, the texts that were used, and sort of, I directed them to say the text. And so it was a kind of, everybody, however they understood what they might imagine to be something kind of evocative, I guess, in relation to memory, brought something, whatever it was. And so yeah, that was the beginning. And then it was going up until this yesterday, all the way up until, well, really, was it this morning? But it was definitely teamwork taking place. I found that really interesting. It's hard to even, at this point, after all of the work that was done with making it, the editing and adjusting it and all of that, it's hard to even think of it as like disparate.
Yes. I mean, it's, I suppose the only thing there's a bit in Chris Marker's masterful film essay, Sunless, Sans Soleil, where he talks about, in effect, his working method, and he grapples with, how he selects images. And I think at one point he talks about images that quicken the heart and images that, et cetera, et cetera. And I was just trying to get across to my collaborators that it's possible to turn the flip side of memory, which is really curiosity, as a working paradigm, that simply being curious about the properties of certain images or sounds was enough of a precondition to get going, that you didn't need like a master narrative beyond that, and that if the objects of curiosity, which then started to suggest rewards, could be brought into some proximity with other objects of curiosity, then just the differing intensities of reward might suggest a narrative. You didn't need more than that, And the other was to take really seriously a project which was completely organized around the immaterial, by having as its choreographing core the sonic. That once you begin to suggest intention with a sonic outline, that then automatically starts to suggest some affinity with the image, which then suggests an affinity with narrative, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there was, everything in there had no logical connection with anything else before they came together. They came from different sources. They had most of them didn't start off with a logic of a narrative. So it was really important to me that we at least got that across, and I think once people seized on the idea that, hey, this could be fun, like you could put aside the responsibility of thought for a moment and meet up with it somewhere further on down the line, things started to work, Or, maybe they have their own ideas.
Well, it's like Fred was saying really earlier on, that he's interested in the process. And I think for us too, it was the process. I've seen such a transformation with the group from when we first initially came up with the idea of let's create something. From that initial reserve and apprehension to a transformation with the way the group even work together now that I've seen. I've actually been watching them transform themselves into a group around the work, and that's been quite fascinating, because instead of it being black audio now, it was me removed one step, looking at a group of people coming together with nothing else binding them together except the making of this production, and the trust and the faith that they had in us to say this will work. And everybody who contributed, it was people went through a process, you know, a trusting process, you know, a number of different processes to be able to make this work. And that was fascinating for me. And I think we may have actually even documented some of those initial workshops to watch that process, that leap of faith, to do something very different than your normal working practices would suggest in this institution or outside of this institution. Yeah.
Okay, we talked in...
We talked too much.
Jay.
We
No,
have
go
something else, actually. There's
Me too.
another thing, but yep, there's one more thing to show.
Well, you basically answered mostly what I was asking, because I actually was very interested in two words come to mind: composition and methodology. That's sort of intertwined. And I know with Black audio in particular, one of the things I was always super attracted to from the beginning, is like really excited to me when I first even read about you guys before I met you, was how you work. You know, and seeing the book, Ghost, your Ghost of Stories, in the book.
Ghost
and
of
then
Songs.
Ghost of Songs, yeah. It has all that information about all the projects that preceded Handsworth, which is where a lot of people like myself entered into Black audio. And, you know, and there's a lot of slides.
Yeah.
There's slide things that I haven't really seen. I've just seen images of them. I've read about them. And I was always really curious about, you know, when I talk about things like abnormativity and stuff like that, to me, it's not just for me about the objects that get produced. It's also about how people work. You know, how different methodologies or procedures preclude certain kinds of artifacts, and they make possible other artifacts, and how oftentimes people work in a way that is understood as momentarily a deficit way of working, because you don't have any other choice, you don't have resources, you don't have a movie camera, you don't have 35, you got 16, you know, you don't have film, you got video, whatever. But how often these things that are deficits actually end up being part and parcel of what's amazing that people produce, even though oftentimes you'll move past that thing, you think like, oh, now I'm becoming more professional, so I'm going to get X, Y, and Z, and you don't realize you're losing
The very thing that...
yeah,
really
some of the
approaches
stuff that
this.
produced what you had in the first place. So what was intriguing to me about Black audio from the beginning was there seemed to be more cognizance of not just discarding things as the guys move forward. You know, like I was very curious from the beginning, like what was the line between Black audio and John Akomfrah? What was the line between Lina? Because I was always super curious about Lina, as like super curious, in particular when I read the book, about Lina, you know, not just as a producer per se, you know what I mean? It's something curious that you don't have opportunity to have it teased out. So it's curious for me to see that, because I was thinking like, wow, this is really, how is that composed is the first thing I wanted to know. You know, like, is it possible? I know it's possible, but in terms of films, you start thinking about artifacts that aren't authored. They don't have an author or a singular author. They just sort of...
Yeah, I mean, I think these guys got a sense of how we operated and the basis on which most of those projects are made. Like, for instance, you know, Laura was did this wonderful paper this morning about Last Angel. Now, it's a good example because I think it tells you something about the fluidity of stuff. So the opening of Last Angel is Edward George, a member of the group, you know, one of the key researchers, standing, you know, in the Mojave saying, "You are here, blah, 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 blah." Now, an hour before we did that, that wasn't the plan. Like, we had all this research and, you know, and I kept thinking, okay, well, I'll take the trip from LA to the Mojave to think about how to, you know, start this thing. And then we got there and I still didn't have a sense of what the center of it might be. And like 20 minutes before, I said to Eddie, "It's you. You're going to have to do it." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Yeah, no, you're going to have to stand in there and do it." And then just that very simple, because I realized that he was the embodiment of all of this knowledge. Like, he had it all. He'd been researching this thing for a year and a half. He was a key researcher calling Floyd, and, you know, there was no other way of doing it except to literally shove him into the frame. So after the Mojave, it's like, okay, what else can we do with him? And the project unfolded, literally, piecemeal, from that initial thought, wish that, if you stuck one of us at the center of it, it might work. The same with these guys. And I just, you kind of, the braggadocio is, yeah, everything can work. Which is what I said to all of them. Just bring anything, it doesn't really matter. We'll find the logic between us. And that was very much a kind of black audio ethic. Nothing was a waste. It's, if we agree on the association, that would be powerful enough to have a transformative impact on the materials on the table itself. In other words, if we build patterns of solidarity, if we built these patterns of solidarity and associations prior to our engagement with the object or the narrative, the hope is that somehow the coming together of these two mutually exclusive things might open neural pathways which will then lead to this moment of alchemy when, we knew what we were doing. You never do, of course, which is what keeps you going, because you're always grappling with what it is that you don't know about the process and what you do know. And there's enough of a tension between the two to sustain a practice, usually for about 10 years. I mean, we were lucky, we had 17, so, but by then, I think what happens is at the end of 17 years, you feel like, okay, well, we're all pretty confident about this shit now. Let's go and do our own thing, and that's pretty much what happened.
Okay, one last thing about the same thing, then I'm gonna let it go, is it seems to me like a big part of what you're talking about is how the aleatory, the contingent, improvisational sort of enter into the work process. And the classic cinema paradigm, at least the Hollywood one, is almost exactly the opposite. It's like it's like a brute force solution. Like you shape the world to coincide to what you envisioned, as opposed to, this other kind of way of interacting. But one of the things that's interesting to me, again, about black audio, is like, when I think of this kind of filmmaking, contingent, improvisatory filmmaking, I do think more of like individual filmmakers, like in a little bit like the way Renée works, you know what I mean? Where it's really Renée going out into the world and you have these interactions and, relational and all this kind of stuff. It seems like it becomes exponentially a little bit more complicated. Like, what's the structure so you can do that with other people? Like, and since that's what's really curious to me. Not curious, but I wonder, what's the applicability of that to, it's almost related to what we were starting to bump up again around the Fred thing.
Absolutely.
It's like, how do you bring those things to bear on movies?
Yeah.
But you see, I was saying to the seminar, I was talking to them on Monday, I think, or Tuesday, about the way we work together on 7 songs, and I was telling them that really the whole thing started to take shape when you brought all of those books of monographs, photographic monographs, Harlem Book of the Dead, I think it was a Sukkot monograph as well, and how that then started to define what the look, it's more than the look, but let's just conveniently call it the look for a moment, might be. Now, that doesn't then preclude the weeks of hard work that went into trying to make sure that happened. I think we shot tests for like 2 weeks or something, so it didn't preclude that, but it was just, what Bell used to call the radical openness of the gesture. That you came and you said, I have this, I want you to see this, see what you think, and we thinking, oh, okay, well, this is a good, there are thousands of other ways of doing this, we might as well embrace this, I don't want to give up on that. I mean, like all the things I learned from Cecil and Miles, and I don't want to give up on that. So for me, and I guess that's always been my reticence and reluctance to embrace this thing. Every time I've gone into this so-called feature mode, I've hated it. I've hated the strictures. Speaking Like a Child was a nightmare to do. You know, and everybody's, oh, it's a great film. I'm like, no, it's a nightmare. You know, I don't like this sense that we can't do what the French call the dérive, the wander. You know, I don't like the idea that, you know, unless you get it now, it's all done. You know, it's just, I'm not temperamentally suited to it. I can do it, but it's not the thing that pleases me the most, you know. And I guess part of it is just to do with the absence of that abyss called failure. So, you know, because so much of feature work, narrative fiction work, is about banishing failure before you even get to the point of doing the thing. It's like, no, we can't, you know, we can't have this possibility at all, you know. And if staring at it somehow is one of the preconditions of your becoming, then you have problems with it. And that's partly what I was trying to say to Fred about the Apex piece. Like, I'm not saying you shouldn't make other things, but it seems to me there's something so compelling about a piece that's completely come into being via this process of you collecting this material, that I would at some point like to say, this is it. Like, there's no beyond this. There could be, but its ontology is not dependent on it being realized in another arena. You know, if, you know, the wish for the other arena, the beyond is great, but if we don't get there, fuck it, who cares? You know, this is a masterpiece in its own right.
But also from what I gather, I mean, what I would say in terms of some of the reasons why I found it really problematic on the classic structure of a feature film is all the checks and balances that go well before you even get to filming. If we could have all the money without those, and I'll give you some examples from the writing stages, who writes, who directs, who produces, going into production, all the kinds of sets and checks and balances, from insurance bonds to people controlling on every side, from production to the creative, and always keeping those two very, very separate, which goes against half the practices that we've been developing. And if those things were taken away and you actually had the money without those preconditions and really, I would say, brutal structures, then we could actually produce, you know, what Fred was saying, I'll give you the money, but without all of that, then that's fine. Then I think then we have got, you know, some kind of ability to take that forward, because I don't think we can fit into that. I mean, we would do it, as John says, but it goes against our almost inner nature now.
But sorry, just one more thing and I'll shut up. I mean, I think partly what I think we wanted to do and have managed to do it is to realize, you know, the multiple platforms in which these operations take place, their limits, to be cognizant of what those limits are, and to direct projects accordingly. Like, for instance, I would never have suggested The Unfinished Conversation to the BBC to make as a documentary. You know, like, it would have been stupid. It's a 3-screen piece. I needed a year and a half of watching 1,000 hours of stuff. That can only come through a gallery system and someone who's willing to fund that experiment, that research. You know, I wouldn't take the march to the BFI, British Film Institute, to function, you know, to fund as a feature film, because I knew this was a TV project, and we needed PBS and French TV and the BBC to come in, and, you know, and then you know what they want. You know, get me the stars, I'll leave you alone, fine. You know, Stuart Hall project, you go to the BFI and you can say, look, we're trying to do something about the guy who started you. He's one of the figures who made this place, the study of film, you know, a legitimate area of inquiry, which is why you exist. Will you fund it? And they were like, hell yeah, you know. So each different projects find their own platforms. And I guess in that sense, Fred's right about the presence of the post-cinematic. You know what I mean? Because they already exist as divergent possibilities. You know.
Oh, could we? I think there's another question over there.
Yeah, and I was just wanted to bring, I mean, that's a good segue to my question, which has to do with this idea between the distinctions between context and meaning, right? And the idea of reception again, so that even if your authorial intentionality is of one thing, it's about finding that context, just like you mapped out, between what is a television audience, what is a cinematic audience, what is a gallery audience in certain ways. And so I just wanted to connect it back to the screening that we had with Come Closer, and just to kind of reiterate or think about not only the collective notion of authorship, but then what does it mean to then re-author and re-find a different meaning in the same, literally the same footage, right? So here in Come Closer, we had footage that we had seen with Tracy Lusitania and other projects that was recut, and the meaning absolutely changes in 2008, even though it's literally the same footage. And so for me, it's about the kind of thinking through not only a collective authorship as a model here, but then what does it mean to go back and sort of re-author meaning, or that idea that comes with a new context. So for me, seeing that footage that I hadn't seen before in the 2008 piece, Come Closer, where the figure shifts away from a kind of standing out amongst the crowd to one that, when I saw that footage yesterday, was one that had a kind of valence of surveillance and almost this kind of other type of viewing onto it, right? So literally that same footage can be reread. And so I think those are the kinds of other models too, in addition between to kind of think about this idea of reception and how reception shifts along with authorial intention at certain moments, and that could be literally, so this idea that collective, the body of work, that a single author can go back in and sort of relook at that meaning production, like you kind of were talking about with the collective work.
Just wanted to say something about that, because I didn't preface it at all. But it's, I think it's interesting what you noticed about it, but I guess I'm interested in a very expanded notion of the forms of reception, and so and how something is evolved from a commission, which was that kind of grew out of a couple. It was a fragment of something that grew out of another commission that was from the National Maritime Museum. And so when you have something like that, it's kind of wide open, differently than what you guys were just describing, but also but that's for a particular kind of situation, like a museum situation. In addition to trying to figure out how it's possible, despite the fact that there are these various constraints, and that's my whole issue, and that despite various kinds of constraints that are related to whatever the particular kind of invitation it is that you've received or what you're looking for, that there are also other kinds of dimensions to it. And so, for example, Come Closer was also published as a script in the journal Multitude, and I wrote it to try to make the other work. And so it was a kind of impetus to think with making that work toward something else that I was making, which ended up being what I showed the clips of yesterday, Endless Dreams and Time-Based Dreams, and 2 other films that go with it. And so it's this sort of, I guess, things that are difficult to contain. That's one of the things I think of as being interesting, and that's why I had mentioned when Fred was talking, and I think he saw those things, that I guess it wasn't close to the time that they were produced, so what he was mentioning at Duke, this ongoingness as well as this expansiveness in terms of how you create a constellation of different sites, literally textual sites as well as exhibition sites. And so anyway, those are some of the ongoing questions also in this project. But I'm going to try to shift this back to something that I'd like these guys to show before we have to end, because we are kind of coming to the end. But was there any, one more question? Okay. Neil.
I was interested in your comment about Miles and Cecil, and I'm assuming you mean Cecil Taylor,
yes,
impacting your practice. And I would just like to hear a little bit more about how they've, either things that they've told you personally or things you've read or things you've heard them do influenced your work and how you work and how improvisation is part of your practice.
I mean, part of it is just the charismatic example of their presence, you know, and the insights you pick up from listening to the music. Some of it's to do with how that music is the language that you know, use to bond with others. Like, for instance, I think AJ and Greg's relationship is pretty much one that was sustained for a decade and a bit by talking principally around music, Miles, Cecil, you know. But also just once you start taking seriously that the jazz aesthetic and the premise of that, and you realize that really it all starts with this thing called improvisation, then, see, for me, it was always part of our practice. I mean, we have always tried to find ways of working in which where we start is almost certainly not where we end, you know. And if works don't have that possibility in them, then I generally don't do them unless they're TV ones, in which case we're doing them because they pay, and then you move on, you know. But all the other things, like, unless the possibility of process is implicit either in the pieces or the situations in which the pieces are going to be gathered and put to use, it's not interesting for me. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, please, go ahead, Laura.
This is something that I'd particularly like to hear from Lina, because I have the impression that working as a collective to make a work that's really good, there has to be some internal tension or argument or negotiation, and I'm imagining, or, you know, something that creates, you know, energy, and I'm imagining that that often happens among the different perspectives of the director, the producer, the researchers, cinematographer, and sound designer, who each of whom, I imagine, you see your emerging film like this, you know, crystal that you can look at from different angles, and it looks like a different thing. So I would really like to hear you either confirm or deny this impression I have.
Just before you answer that, because it's very much related to what she was just saying, so you can pile them both in your response. It just seems to me like the conundrum, you just mapped it out there. You guys both talked about it, and it does go back to what I think we were talking about earlier.
Indeed.
The conundrum is, as you said, if people give you large sums of money and it's supposed to end up in a certain platform, they want to predict not only that it's going to end up there on a certain time, but it's going to be more or less what they felt like they subsidized. And how do you, I mean, have you just sort of accepted that it's not for us in the way jazz musicians accepted that orchestral, large-scale orchestral pieces weren't for them? Or is it still like, do you think about, you know, I mean, yeah, we all want to win the Moden Lotto, but, you know, lottery, but, I mean, how many of us are going to get that? So it just seems to me like I'm very, very curious, and I think it's related to what Laura was just saying. It's like how these tensions, the internal, you know what I mean, how it works itself out. Do you just say, okay, these things over here are not for us? And
yeah, that seems especially like a question for Lina.
Yeah, I think it is primarily a Lina question. I have one.
I think it depends project by project, to be really honest with you, and the platforms that we're aiming for them. We do a lot of talking before we put on those producer directing hats together. The projects emerge from a lot of discussion, and then we sort of tend to splinter off and come back together again. There's a continuous dialogue with the working process that we have. Sometimes shorthand, but most often we come together to talk through what the possibilities are, whether it's aesthetically, whether it's financially, and those two often sometimes, reflect on each other. So for us, it does depend on where we're also aiming for those projects, because if we're aiming for broadcast, I mean, there's nothing that we've done even for broadcast where we're not pushing the boundaries in one form or another. So for us, it would always be trying to do something slightly different, even if it is for a mainstream broadcaster. If you look at the mainstream broadcast work that we've done, they've all been for BBC or PBS or A&E or whoever they're Channel 4. They're all very different, whether it's the look, the technology we bring to it, there is a difference, I think you will see with the film. So we try to even break some boundaries while we're in those kind of mainstream areas. When I suppose we're much freer in the areas of the slightly more experimental cinematic areas with the BFI, the British Film Institute, where we're given a lot more room to manoeuvre and to be on our own and to develop the process. And the same with the gallery space, And I was going to just say one other thing about reception that you mentioned, Gloria. And I think these things also relate to each other. I think after 25 years of producing the body of work, there now is also people like Laura, Fred, AJ, who've all now begun to write about the different practices, about Renée's work, our work, Sankofa, Isaac Jr., whoever. Yeah. And that has also contributed to how you're received, how your audience begins to receive you, how you're received financially on different platforms and different, that also impacts all the way through. And I thought that was a really important point to just tag on to the end of that. Sorry if I haven't answered both your questions properly, but there isn't a constant dialogue no matter whatever project we actually do. So those frictions are, energies are brought from the very beginning.
So we've come to that point in which we can actually, there's one more thing, and it's a kind of nice way to end, I think, which is a film, very, very short.
Yeah, the Venice Film Festival celebrated its, I think, 70th this year, and it asked 60 of us or 50, I can't remember how many directors now, to do something. And we began experimenting with stills animation as a way of making stories. So what you're going to see is not from the Canon 7D or 5D, it's just a plain old stills camera shooting thousands of frames. Enjoy. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I'd also like to say that you're invited to come this weekend to the Harvard Film Archive. I'd like to thank David Pendleton, the programmer there, for working with these guys. So on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, they're going to be screening various films. You can check online, ACT, MIT, or at the Harvard Film Archive. You can find the information. And John and Lina are going to be around for the Q&A on Sunday and on Monday. And on Monday we'll screen. They're going to screen the Stuart Hall project. So. That's Monday. That is Monday. I can't keep the whole thing straight, so look online. Yeah. So, okay, thank you, everybody, for participating. And,
thank you, Renée Green, MIT, IBA, students.